I used to do a lot of urban exploring out of Chicago, and me and my crew ticked off a lot of places over the years. There are the big grain silos in Pilsen, left empty after a big explosion, and then near Joliet there's an old prison with cells and chapels now open for tours. In Gary, Indiana, we saw this incredibly beautiful but decaying church. Then, under Chicago, there are old freight tunnels, mostly closed off now, that were anything but beautiful. The old Chicago post office was huge and empty for years, and there's the old Cook County Hospital, now becoming a hotel but once a place right out of Silent Hill. But then, after a while, we started looking further to hit up places that we hadn't been before, and that's when we heard about a place in the middle of nowhere over in Iowa called Buckhorn. Back in the 1900s, Buckhorn used to be a pretty prosperous place because of the big creamery that they had in town. It used to turn out hundreds of tons of butter a week, and it employed almost everyone in town. But then, when rising costs forced the creamery to shut down, it meant just about the whole town was suddenly out of work overnight. And with no jobs, people started leaving, one family at a time. Then I think by the 80s or early 90s, the place was just a total ghost town. We did some research online, mainly using Urbex forums where others would post about their experiences, and drew up a list of places we wanted to visit. There was obviously the old creamery, which was huge and falling apart, but there was also the abandoned church and cemetery we could take a look at, along with a handful of other places too. It looked like a great place to explore. The only drawback was the 4-hour car ride, and since it was late October when we got the urge to visit, it meant starting the journey at the crack of dawn if we wanted to hit up all of our chosen spots before it went dark. So, one day in early November, we loaded up my friend Mike's van, and then we drove off down Highway 64 in the direction of the Iowa state line. The weather was miserable when we hit the road. A cold, gray Saturday morning that I'd much rather have just spent in bed. But honestly, Urbex when the weather is nice feels kind of odd, and no filter in existence makes a place feel gloomier or creepier than a naturally overcast sky. And on top of that, the prospect of hitting up a brand new place kept us so excited that we didn't mind that the heating in Mike's van was completely broken. And besides, each of us was dressed for the Arctic, so the cold was at the back of our minds as we got closer and closer to Buckhorn. When we arrived, the town was exactly as you'd imagine. Empty and silent, with buildings that looked like they'd crumble if you so much as looked at them for too long. The streets were overgrown with weeds, and apart from the sound of the wind whispering around the abandoned buildings, it was completely silent. We started at the old schoolhouse, a building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own rotting structure, and inside, the air was musty and dank, and there were leaks almost everywhere from the previous day's rain. How the place was still standing was beyond me, and I was way more worried about it coming down on our heads, even after I saw what was written on the chalkboard. Mike pointed it out at first, directing us into a classroom that had the word "danger" written on the chalkboard in big white letters with an exclamation point. Mike was smiling when he showed us, and it got a little chuckle out of me too. You see a lot of that kind of spooky graffiti around well-trodden Urbex sites, and it's usually a little more creative than just danger. You pay attention to official-looking signs and warnings about unstable structures or active power cables and all of that, but when it comes to stuff like "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here," or "Pennywise's lair," you tend not to take it very seriously. And we figured the danger on the chalkboard amounted to some other Urbexer's tag, like an unsettling way of saying, "I got here first." But these days, I think that graffiti was much more significant than we first imagined. We moved on to the other classrooms, checking the chalkboards for more messages, but there was nothing. And I remember the desk being covered in a thick layer of dust, and after wiping at some of it with his glove to see just how thick it really was, Mike started playfully chasing us around and threatening to wipe that grime on one of our jackets. And that's when I first noticed something was off with our friend Tom. He was usually the most enthusiastic of us. His camera was always ready, his curiosity was boundless, but that day, he seemed tired and distracted, almost like he was in some kind of daze. He barely reacted as Mike came at him, and when he did notice what was on his finger, he didn't really even find it funny. He just snapped at Mike. Not overly harshly or anything, but we knew that the joke was over and moved on from the school to the general store. The shelves were still stocked with cans made by brands that we'd never heard of, and some of their labels faded so badly that we could barely read them. Tommy stayed quiet as we walked the aisles, which, again, was totally not like him. By the time we got to the old town hall, his behavior had gotten even weirder. He seemed like he was muttering to himself, his eyes darting around like he was seeing things that we couldn't. Then suddenly, Tommy reached up and just started clutching his nose. Blood poured out, dark and thick and staining his gray gloves, and he looked scared. We tried to help, but he backed up and held out an arm like, "Get the hell off of me." And his nose was bleeding so much that one of us actually asked if Tommy was good to keep going. But the idea seemed to just irritate him even more than his nosebleed did. He said we hadn't driven all that way to just turn around and leave over a nosebleed, and in the moment, I appreciated how unselfish it sounded. No one wanted to just leave, not if we could avoid it. So as Mike went into his pack to get our first aid kit so Tommy could stem the blood coming out of his nose, I wandered off alone towards the old sheriff's office to take a look around. It looked much like I had imagined it to at first. Reception area, back office, hallway leading to what must have been cells of some description. It wasn't immediately visible from the front door, but the second I turned the corner into the reception area, I saw it. In huge black letters, daubed in what must have been spray paint, were the words, "If you bleed, leave Buckhorn and never return." The sight of it sent literal shivers down my spine immediately, and I ran back to tell the others. I told them that we had to leave, but again, Tommy objected. And I started to explain that what I'd seen written on the wall of the sheriff's office, and as I did, Mike and the others started to listen. But I still only got a couple of words out before Tommy went nuts and started screaming at me. He says something like, "How many times do I have to say it? We're not leaving, all right?" Then as he started walking towards me, still yelling, others jumped in to hold him back, thinking that he was about to punch me. We worked to calm him down, and it kind of seemed like we did at first. But then, when I look back on it, I think that's when that weird kind of fatigue started to set in. We basically managed to drag Tommy back to the van after he stopped struggling because we were convinced that he was going through some kind of medical emergency. He offered to take him to the hospital, but all he wanted to do was go home. The drive back was just quiet and very tense. Tommy's nosebleed had stopped, but he was very pale, and his breathing shallow, and he passed out before we even hit the highway, and his body was just limp against the seat. We tried to wake him when we got back to town, but he was unresponsive, barely stirring even when we shook him. The fact that he even showed signs of life was a huge relief. Then, when we finally got him to his apartment, Tommy was acting like someone recovering from some deep sleep, very groggy, very confused. And we just left him to rest, and we asked his mom and sister to keep an eye on him after telling them what had happened, but we were all very shaken by what had taken place. The image of that warning on the wall, the nosebleed, and the fear in Tommy's eyes had just all played over and over again in my mind. And lying in bed that night, I couldn't shake off the unease of what we'd seen. Why did Tommy react that way? And what was it either in or about Buckhorn that made him act like that? The warning in the sheriff's office was very clear, but its implications were terrifying. Was it some kind of chemical exposure? And if so, why was it only Tommy who reacted that way? I thought about the stories that I'd heard of Buckhorn, tales of that town that once thrived but fell due to reasons that were never quite clear. And I'd read about the creamery shutting down, but it didn't occur to me until then that it didn't say why the creamery was shut down in any of the posts that I'd read. Some spoke of economic downfall, but there was nothing about a mysterious illness or any other kind of unexplained events that led to its abandonment. The next day, I did some research, but found nothing that could really explain what had happened to him. There were no records of toxic spills, no known unusual occurrences officially documented. Yet the physical and psychological impact on Tom was undeniable, and we all saw it. It scared the hell out of us. He was the only one who bled and the only one who started acting strange like that, or at least strange in a way that we could see and recognize. I wrote this down not because I'm good with words, but because I need to warn others. If you ever hear about Buckhorn, if someone suggests a reason to visit, just don't. Stay the hell away from that place. Whatever's there isn't just the ghost of the past, it's something that can reach out and touch you and make you bleed, make you lose yourself. My friend has recovered, but honestly, you might pay a very high price uncovering whatever secrets that place holds. What feels like a lifetime ago, I decided to go visit a friend living in San Francisco, which involved driving just over 1,000 miles from our hometown of Montrose, Colorado. My plan was drive all the way through Utah in a single day, spend the night at the Holiday Inn in a little place called Ely, Nevada, and then drive the rest of the way to San Fran after a good night's sleep and a decent breakfast. Thankfully, I made it on time and in one piece, but that didn't mean that the journey went smoothly. It might sound funny, but I'd never been to Utah before the drive to San Francisco. It's less than 100 miles west of Montrose, but if I left town, it was usually to drive east to Boulder or maybe Denver. I knew eastern Colorado could be pretty desolate, but Utah was a whole other story. By the time I drove through a place called Delta, the landscape looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. The road had been nothing but a straight line through the desert for hours, and about 30 to 45 minutes past Delta, I realized that I messed up. I should have stopped for gas when I had the chance, and by the time I realized my gas gauge was creeping towards empty, I started to panic a little bit. The last thing I wanted was to be stranded in the middle of nowhere, so you can imagine my relief when I suddenly saw a sign up ahead. It was the first sign of civilization since I'd left Delta, a solitary gas station sign which read, "Last Chance Gas 5 miles." I thanked God out loud, not that I'm really a believer, but you get where I'm coming from. And then a few minutes later, I spotted what looked like a small town coming up on the horizon. It sort of clung to the highway, this cluster of dilapidated buildings with peeling paint and broken windows. Not the nicest place I'd ever seen, but it was a very welcome sight. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled into the station, and there was no one at the pumps, no cars in sight, and no sign of life from the small store attached to the station. When I turned off the engine, I was suddenly struck by how quiet everything was. I glanced around and saw the town was eerily still. People talk about sleepy desert towns, but I remember thinking, sleepy? This place is in a goddamned coma. Approaching the gas pump, I noticed it was of an old model, the kind that you don't really see anymore. The nozzle felt heavy, and the kind of heavy where it feels like it was designed to just last forever. But when I tried to pump gas, there was just no flow. I shook it, gave it a tap against the pump, hoping that might fix it, but there was nothing. It was like the pump itself was just completely empty. Assuming that there was some trick to getting the pump to work that only the station's attendant might know, I went into the old gas station to look for some help. The door creaked when I opened it, and a bell rang, sounding weirdly loud, and the place looked old, very old. Snacks on the shelves were vintage, like those bright, colorful candies from like decades ago, and the cash register was almost from another era, all metal, very heavy, with just huge buttons. And the posters on the walls were very faded, showing promotions for movies and events from probably all the way back in 2001. And when I got there, this was, I think, the fall of 2009. I called out hello, but my voice just echoed back at me and no one seemed to answer. On the counter, there was an old newspaper from 8 years ago talking about some kind of festival, and the calendar behind the counter was stuck on the same date as that newspaper, still showing June 2001. And that's when I started to feel very uneasy. I went to check the back room, and the door was open a little, and inside was more of the same. There was a mug with what looked like old, dry remains of coffee at the bottom, a coat still hanging on the back of a chair, and a silent radio that was plugged in but not playing anything. I found a ledger with the last entry on the same day as the newspaper, and it was like everyone in town just disappeared on that day. I left the back room and saw through the window that the playground across the street was empty, swings moving gently in the wind, but no kids or adults around. Then on the way back to my car, I just felt this burning curiosity taking over my unease, and I decided to just look around a little more in the town before I drove off. Every door I tried was locked, and every window was dusty with grime and soot, like no one had been there for a long time. In one house, the door was slightly open, and inside it was like whoever lived there had stepped out of their house in the expectation they'd be back in mere minutes, but they'd never come back. A book was open on a couch. There was another glass of dried something with dead mold clinging to the rim of it, and upstairs, a kid's room had toys scattered on the floor, like play had just suddenly stopped and never resumed. I knew that I shouldn't have been in there, but I just had to check. And after I backed out of that kid's room, two thoughts were going back and forth in my head. The first being, just what in the hell was I thinking walking around a total stranger's house? It was like I came to my senses thinking, what if all these good but slightly untidy folks are at a county fair or something, and some psycho, me, is just wandering around their homes? I also appreciate how in denial that sounds, but never underestimate the mind's ability to try and rationalize things in favor of going into complete fight or flight mode. But the second thought was more in lines with, okay, I'm pretty sure something bad happened to these people, and if I don't get the hell out of here, whatever happened to them is going to happen to me too. And I hurried back to my car, feeling like I really shouldn't be there now, but also with that horrible feeling that someone was watching me, even though I was 99% sure the place was completely abandoned. In my car, I tried my phone, really didn't have any reception, and next I actually tried the radio, and it was just crappy static. I mean, I guess we technically were in like a dead zone out there. As I started the car, I was worried that I was going to run out of gas and end up stranded in the middle of nowhere. But that place had me so unsettled that it seemed worth the risk. If I got stranded, it'd suck, but it was damn sure preferable to staying in that place for even a minute longer. And thankfully, I had just enough gas to make it to cross the state line and actually make it to Ellie. But by the time I rolled into Chevron, I'm not even exaggerating when I said I was running on fumes. As I filled up my car, I noticed that I had some bars finally on my phone, but since I didn't want to use it at the gas station, they still had signs up back then saying, "Please do not use your cell phone." And I went inside to ask the clerk if I could use their phone instead, which would also give me the chance to ask them about that abandoned town. The clerk seemed to have no idea what I was talking about, but that didn't really surprise me, I suppose. What did was how matter-of-fact the deputy sheriff was when I called his office back in Utah. The clerk knew enough to know that I must have come through Millard County if I'd been on Route 50, so I knew I had the right people when I called them up after looking through the phone book. The first deputy I talked to knew what I was talking about and knew the place. They called it Millburg, that it had been abandoned for a number of years, and he just really didn't know why, I guess. I then asked if I could talk to someone higher up, and he put me on the phone with the deputy sheriff who, like I said, was very open about some things. He just wasn't so open about others. When I told him about the abandoned town, he actually gave me a little chuckle as he was like, "Oh, yeah, you must have stopped in Millburg. The place has been empty for years now." He told me I had nothing to worry about, and despite it looking very creepy, there was nothing sinister about the place at all. More like, the place had been scheduled for demolition for a few years, but the people who bought the land couldn't get permits. So, till they did, Millard County had its very own ghost town, one that even attracted the odd tourists who actually enjoyed getting the willies from being in an abandoned place like Millburg. And I'll be honest, the sheriff's answer was actually very reassuring, and I felt kind of silly for having worked myself up into a minor freakout over it. But then, just before we were about to end that call, I asked the sheriff why Millburg had been abandoned. And he paused and then asked me, "You some kind of reporter?" And when I told him no, he said if I wanted to talk about it, I was more than welcome to stop by their office over in Fillmore, and he was much more comfortable talking about it face to face rather than over the phone. Now call me paranoid, but I think that was sort of like a bluff or something. I think he was counting on me to not stop by the office to talk about this, and he was kind of right because I didn't. I kept going towards San Francisco, and was only like an hour or so later than my schedule, so like I said at the start, I made it in one piece and on time. But it was majorly on my mind for the rest of that day, and my friends and I, who I'd driven all the way out there to see, had a long talk about it that evening, and it amounted to this. My friends basically said that, yeah, something bad probably did happen out there in Millburg, but that it wasn't something I should be fixating on. The right authorities seemed to be on top of it, and no wonder the deputy sheriff was cautious of reporters. He'd probably been burned in the past after some loose talk made it into the papers, and my friend thought it was basically a case of my imagination getting the better of me after having stopped somewhere that I shouldn't have. I mentioned the fact that if I have stopped in Delta for gas like I was supposed to, I'd have just rolled through Millburg like it was any other town, and it wouldn't have been on my mind like it was. My friend then told me to live in that reality. Pretend that I'd never even seen Millburg, because when it comes to events where whole towns disappear, sometimes ignorance truly is bliss. That helped me keep Millburg off my mind for a couple of days, but obviously when the trip drew to an end, I had to drive back the way I came. I considered taking a diversion, and stopping in Fillmore to see if I could talk to the deputy sheriff again. But then I was reminded of what my friend told me, and after making sure that I had enough gas, I floored it after seeing Millburg in the distance, zooming through that town in barely 2 or 3 seconds, and I didn't look back, not even for a second. On May 20th of 1999, the South Australian police were investigating a missing persons case linked to the city of Adelaide when they received a tip from an informant. They were to drive 80 miles north to a small municipality of around 300 people named Snowtown. Once there, they were to make their way to the old abandoned bank on First Street and conduct a thorough inspection of the bank's vault. 2 South Australian police officers drove for hours along the nation's A1 highway. Then upon their arrival in Snowtown, they parked their cruiser outside the abandoned bank. After gaining access to the secure structure and with their flashlights at the ready, the 2 officers crept down dark and dusty hallways until they reached the bank's vault. There, they found the large steel door had been left ajar. Then after pulling it open, they discovered half a dozen large plastic barrels. The officers must have had their suspicions, but to be certain, one of them crept forwards and peeled back just a small portion of one of the barrel's lids. And the stench was overpowering. After a total of 8 human corpses were pulled out of the 6 plastic drums, the Australian media went into a veritable frenzy. The previously sleepy village of Snowtown became the center of a gruesome investigation, capturing national attention and sending the general public into a state of near panic. They demanded a swift and robust response from the South Australian police, who were to open an investigation into the murders immediately. But they were told that, in truth, law enforcement had been investigating a series of disturbing disappearances for the past 5 years, and their case seemed to center around a man named John Bunting. John Justin Bunting was born on September 4th of 1966 in Inarla, Queensland, and it's believed that he had a relatively normal and stable upbringing. State social services have no records of him being abused or neglected by his parents, and until the age of 8, his school reports painted a picture of a perfectly normal little boy. But shortly after entering the 3rd grade, something terrible happened to little Johnny Bunting. While playing at the home of a neighbor, 8-year-old Johnny found himself alone in a room with his friend's much older brother. John was cornered, beaten, and then carnally assaulted by a boy much older and stronger than him, and the experience left him with a profound hatred of both homosexuals and pedophiles. As a teenager, he developed a healthy fascination with photography and was said to have a talented eye for composition. His fixation with human anatomy, on the other hand, was, to put it mildly, not so healthy. But on what bordered on downright pathological was John's obsession with acts of physical violence. At age 22, Bunting found work at a Queensland abattoir and was not only highly proficient in his work, but reportedly bragged about enjoying the factory-style slaughter he and his co-workers indulged in. In 1991, a 25-year-old Bunting would relocate to the Adelaide suburb of Salisbury, and here he befriended 2 of his neighbors, 20-year-old Robert Joe Wagner and 33-year-old Mark Ray Hayden. Bunting was known to be intensely charismatic and could exert significant psychological control over others. He also had a highly dominant personality and relished the opportunity to take on a leadership role within his group, which included people who were vulnerable, disaffected, and looking for direction. Over the next few years, Bunting curated a small but viciously loyal social circle of those who shared his deep hatred for pedophiles, homosexuals, and others he deemed morally corrupt. But over time, what started as a kind of recreational outrage transformed into something deeper and darker, something more like ideology than opinion. He then went about convincing his acolytes that they should engage in vigilante justice, drawing others into his worldview through slow but persistent indoctrination. He would become a central figure in their lives, providing a sense of belonging or family, which was crucial for people like Mark Hayden, Robert Wagner, and James Velocicus. These men became accomplices in what Bunting framed as a moral crusade, but was, in reality, a terrifying spree of sadistic violence motivated by greed, control, and prejudice. The murders began in August of 1992, when a 20-year-old man named Clinton Douglas Tresize was invited over to Bunting's apartment on the pretense of a social call. Bunting, having acted as both judge and jury, had declared Tresize an abuser of children. Then, right there in his living room, in front of his baying adherents, he beat the 20-year-old to death with a shovel and then had him buried in a shallow grave. In 1997, Tresize was the subject of 2 episodes of the Australian television show Australia's Most Wanted. Bunting watched an episode of the show with Vlasikis and his mother and reportedly boasted, "That's my handiwork." 26-year-old Ray Davies was Bunting's next target, because in 1993, he entered into a relationship with an ex-girlfriend of Bunting's named Suzanne Allen. Reportedly to be intellectually disabled, he was accused of making inappropriate advances towards Allen's grandsons, yet these allegations appear flimsy at best. Following the termination of their relationship, Ray Davies and Suzanne Allen remained close friends, and the former actually lived on the latter's property in a small caravan at the time he was targeted. To some, this was testament to the idea that the accusations had been spurious, but to Bunting, it was evidence of a vile conspiracy between the two. And on Boxing Day of 1995, Suzanne Allen's daughter witnessed Bunting and her mother clearing out Davies' caravan. Bunting later told James Vlasikis that he had murdered Ray Davies on Christmas Day, not only with the assistance of his wife, but also Vlasikis' own mother. They had reportedly stabbed him in both legs, immobilizing him before Robert Wagner strangled him unconscious. The group then drove 90 minutes to a home in a town known as Bakara, where they tossed their victim into an empty bathtub and tortured him. Initially, the purported purpose of the torture was to get Davies to reveal his bank details, and if he did, he was assured that his anguish would cease. It was a lie. Once the group had drained his bank account, Davies was beaten to death with the same sharpened metal pole used to mutilate his genitals. And next on the list was Davies and Bunting's ex-girlfriend, 47-year-old Suzanne Allen. According to Bunting, she was being targeted for execution due to her perverse collusions with Ray Davies. In reality, Bunting simply wanted her money. It's unclear how she was killed, but Allen's plastic-wrapped remains were discovered buried at Bunting's Salisbury property in May of 1999. Following her murder, Bunting claimed $17,000 of her pension through fraudulent means. Although Allen most likely died by Bunting's hand, charges were eventually dropped by the prosecution due to their lack of evidence, and the perpetrators were tried but not found guilty as a result of a hung jury. And her case was never tried again. Next up was 19-year-old Michael Gardner, a cousin of Robert Wagner's wife. By September of 1997, Gardner had been cross-dressing for a number of years, thus drawing the ire of the highly homophobic Bunting. Bunting had reportedly witnessed him playing with Wagner's children, when he grabbed one of them by the arm and placed his hand over their mouth. Small children sometimes say some pretty terrible things, partly out of malice and partly out of ignorance. So, from the sounds of it, Gardner had simply heard one of the children say something rude or explicit, and was attempting to correct them with an easily understood but ultimately physical gesture. Yet to Bunting, the sight proved a potent reminder of his own carnal violation at the hands of his friend's older brother, and in that moment, Bunting decided Gardner had to die. He and Robert Wagner somehow convinced Gardner to accompany them to a place called Murray Bridge. There, Gardner was taken to a shed, then repeatedly strangled as a form of torture. Every time he collapsed due to lack of oxygen, Bunting and Wagner would force the teenager to stand up straight before they strangled him all over again. Finally, when Gardner passed out for a 4th or 5th time, Bunting kept his hands wrapped around his victim's throat, squeezing and tightening his grip until Gardner expired. The two killers then staged a robbery at Gardner's apartment, stealing some of his landlady's belongings. When this landlady somehow got in touch with Bunting to inquire after her errant tenant's whereabouts, he convinced her that Gardner had been the one to burglarize her residence in order to pay for a sex change operation. Gardner's decomposing corpse was then kept in a plastic barrel in the very same shed he was murdered in until it was eventually moved to the Snowtown bank vault. His left foot had been severed so the drum's lid could be properly sealed. Bunting's next victim was another ex-girlfriend, 42-year-old Vanessa Lane. Bunting had previously welcomed Lane into his circle of acolytes due to her willingness to aid in the hunt for child molesters, yet ironically, her home was firebombed after she too was accused of grooming a local schoolboy. In the aftermath of the firebombing, she attempted to lay low, but ended up beginning a relationship with an 18-year-old boy by the name of Thomas Trevelyan. Somehow, Trevelyan ended up reaching out to John Bunting, whereby he was informed that Lane had been grooming and molesting him long before he came of age. It's unclear why Trevelyan would betray his new girlfriend in such a way, but the move undoubtedly signed the woman's death warrant. And on October 17th of 1997, Bunting, Wagner, and Trevelyan picked Vanessa Lane up from her home, apparently following some kind of reconciliation. Lane was then prompted to verbally abuse her own mother via telephone, then told to inform her that she wanted nothing more to do with her, was moving to Queensland, and was never coming back. In all likelihood, Lane was led to believe that the rebuke of her own mother would prove her loyalty to the group. In reality, it was a trap. Should she suddenly disappear, Lane's mother was just about the only person who cared enough to report her daughter missing. With a relationship in jeopardy, Lane became an easy target, and one by one, her toes were crushed with metal pliers as she was tortured for her bank account details. When she revealed them, she was promptly strangled to death. Less than a month later, on November 4th of 1997, an increasingly unhinged Thomas Trevelyan began chasing a dog around his neighborhood while armed with a knife. Having reportedly been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, Bunting saw Trevelyan as a liability that, and I quote, would go mental on them. The next day, under the pretense of undertaking another bashing, as Bunting referred to the murders, Bunting drove Trevelyan to Carisbrook in the Adelaide Hills. He was discovered hanging from a tree in Humbug Scrub the following day. Next on the chopping block was an associate of James Velasquez, a 29-year-old named Gavin Porter. A diagnosed schizophrenic, Porter moved to Adelaide from Victoria following the death of his mother in 1997. He and Velasquez were heroin addicts, a trait which caused Bunting to dub him a waste of flesh, although it's unclear why Velasquez wasn't singled out for similar treatment. Porter was sleeping in a parked car on Bunting's property when he and Wagner attacked him. Once he was dead, his body was displayed to Velasquez potentially as a warning, before being put into a barrel for disposal. The group's next target was Velasquez's half-brother, 21-year-old Troy Eude. Velasquez claimed Eude had repeatedly subjected him to brutal abuse during his youth, prompting Bunting to add his name to their so-called kill list. They drove over to Eude's home in the middle of the night before they bound him, threw him into his own bathtub, and tortured him relentlessly. This marked the first time Bunting brought along a video camera so he could make a record of his grisly crimes. Once the device was rolling, Bunting used pliers to crush Eude's toes and increase the intensity of the torture if his victim failed to call him God or Master. Following this period of torture in which Eude was forced to reveal sensitive financial information, he was executed by strangulation. Next up was Mark Hayden's nephew, 18-year-old Frederick Robert Brooks. Bunting became fixated on the spurious idea that Brooks had been, quote, touching up young girls, and decided that something needed to happen to him. September of 1998 saw Brooks accepted into the Australian Air Force Cadets, an occasion which Bunting, Wagner, and Velasquez claimed they wished to celebrate. Brooks was tricked into showing up in an abandoned property, a so-called party house, but all that awaited him was humiliation, torture, and death. The three men shoved lit cigarettes into his ears and his nostrils, and a lit sparkler was inserted into his urethra. A syringe was used to inject bleach into his testicles, which was wired to a variac, sending painful electrical impulses through his body. His toes were crushed by pliers before finally he choked to death on his gag. The next target was a physically and mentally disabled man, 29-year-old Gary O'Dwyer. Having discovered that O'Dwyer received sizable monthly disability payments from the Australian government, he was targeted by Bunting and his associates, who tortured him for his financial details before strangling him to death. The group's penultimate murder was that of Mark Hayden's own wife, 37-year-old Elizabeth, who was apparently on the verge of reporting Bunting's crimes to the police. After making sure that she was home alone, she was murdered by John Bunting and Robert Wagner after they forced their way into her home. Later that day, her remains were exhibited to her husband, who merely laughed before ordering the disposal of her corpse. Ultimately, the group's final victim was James Velasquez's half-brother, 24-year-old David Johnson. Bunting despised Johnson and referred to him using homophobic slurs on account of his cleanliness and sharp appearance. On May 9th of 1999, the group tricked Johnson into driving out to the abandoned bank in Snowtown under the pretense of purchasing a cheap computer. There, he was overpowered as soon as he stepped into the building, and following his murder, Bunting and Wagner reportedly fried pieces of his flesh before eating them. For years, Bunting's crimes went completely undetected, partly because the victims were people whose disappearances did not raise immediate alarm. However, suspicions began to grow as more individuals went missing under mysterious circumstances. A break in the case when Velasquez, the youngest member of the group, confessed his involvement to the police. Being the group's only heroin addict, it's possible that he was detained following a minor legal infraction such as theft or possession of illegal substances. Then, while in custody, withdrawal symptoms would have made him a ripe target for police pressure. His detailed account of the murders and the group's methods provided investigators with the evidence needed to unravel the full extent of the crimes. Police surveillance eventually led them to Snowtown, where the plastic disposal barrels were finally uncovered. The Snowtown murders resulted in one of the most complex and expensive legal proceedings in Australian history. Bunting and Wagner were convicted of multiple murders, then sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. James Velasquez received a reduced sentence after cooperating with authorities, but was still sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 26 years. Mark Hayden, who played a lesser role, was convicted of assisting with the disposal of bodies and received a sentence of 25 years. The trial shed light on the group's twisted dynamics, with Bunting revealed as the manipulative ringleader who exerted an almost cult-like influence over his accomplices. The court also heard harrowing testimony regarding the suffering endured by the group's victims, painting a grim picture of the killer's utter lack of empathy as well as their boundless greed. The revelation of the murders shocked the tight-knit community of Snowtown, which had previously been known for little more than its rural charm. The town's name became synonymous with the atrocities, leading some residents to push for a charge in its name to escape the stigma. While the town remains officially named Snowtown, its reputation had been indelibly linked to the crimes. But beyond Snowtown, the case promoted broader discussions in Australia about how society treats vulnerable individuals. But ultimately, the Snowtown murders are also a stark illustration of how prejudice, greed, and manipulation can combine to create a strain of near limitless malevolence. The Flannan Isles, or Seven Hunters, are an isolated chain of islands situated more than 40 miles off the Scottish mainland. These uninhabited islands, which stand proud among the unforgiving North Atlantic, are accessible only by private boat or rare tours, with their harsh weather and rugged cliffs deterring all but the hardiest of visitors. The largest of these far-flung islands is known as Eilean Moor, and is known to naturalists as being a sanctuary for seabirds such as the Atlantic puffin, the black-legged kittiwake, and the European shag. It was also the site of one of the most perplexing and haunting mysteries of the 20th century. The Flannan Isles lighthouse was constructed on Eilean Moor between the years of 1895 and 1899, with the purpose of guiding ships through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. Designed by David Allen Stevenson and standing at 75 feet tall, the lighthouse represented a significant feat of engineering, and its construction, amidst harsh winds and unforgiving seas, could in itself be considered an immense achievement. It was first lit on December 7th of 1899, with 3 full-time lighthouse keepers being appointed: James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and a man named William Ross. However, during the winter of 1899, Mr. Ross came down with a rather debilitating illness and was temporarily replaced by a man named Donald MacArthur. The keeper's daily routine included maintaining the lighthouse, ensuring the light was operational, and logging weather conditions in addition to any notable events. They were trusted to be reliable and punctual in their routine, and for more than a year, they were. But on December 15th of the year 1900, entries in the logbook suddenly and inexplicably ceased. 3 days later, on December 18th, a steamer sailing from Philadelphia to Scotland reported that Flannan Lighthouse had gone dark. The report was not immediately acted upon due to severe weather conditions, which delayed any investigation until December 26th, when a lighthouse relief vessel could finally be dispatched to the island. Upon arrival, the crew of the relief vessel expected some kind of mechanical problem, but after making their way to the almost 100-foot-tall monolith, they found it completely abandoned. The entrance gate and the main door were closed, the beds were unmade, and the lighthouse's clock had stopped. Inside the kitchen, a meal had been laid out, but not eaten, and one set of oilskins was missing, suggesting at least one keeper had gone outside for some reason. There were no signs of struggle or violence, just an eerie silence, and the enduring question of just what in the hell happened to our 3 lighthouse keepers. One of the most widely accepted explanations is that while securing equipment on the notoriously perilous West Landing, the keepers were caught by a massive freak wave, which washed all 3 from the island in one fell swoop. Evidence which points to this include bent iron railings, a displaced rock, and scattered supplies, indicating a sudden storm of significant force struck the island, catching the keepers unprepared. Despite no such storm being recorded elsewhere, and thus casting a great deal of doubt on such a theory, weather patterns on the region can be unpredictable. It's therefore very possible a rogue wave or freak storm hit an isolated area around the lighthouse and swept the doomed lighthouse keepers from the island. Another theory suggested a violent, potentially deadly altercation between the lighthouse keepers, one that ended in a fatal accident or perhaps even murder. Donald MacArthur was known to have a volatile personality and might well have instigated some kind of physical confrontation. Additionally, the isolation of lighthouse duties can strain relationships, leading to heightened tension. Yet the lack of any signs of a scuffle or violence in the lighthouse makes this theory less plausible unless the conflict occurred outside, whereby evidence could be washed away by the sea. The isolation and history of the Flannan Isles, once a place of pagan worship, have fueled supernatural theories. Local folklore speaks of spirits or so-called fairy storms that could have whisked the men away. However, this is more folklore than fact, but has been popularized in various cultural representations like poems and songs. The Flannan Isles do indeed have a rich tapestry of myth and legend, including tales of sea monsters and ancient gods. Yet while these stories enhance the mystery's allure, they offer no plausible explanation to those grounded in logic and reason. More improbable theories include abduction by foreign agents, or the keepers choosing to escape their secluded lives in what might be called voluntary disappearances. While such theories are intriguing, they are largely unsupported by evidence and lean heavily into the realm of speculation. Though highly unlikely due to the logistics of such an operation on a remote island, the idea of abduction might entertain those who enjoy spy thrillers, but no geopolitical context or motive supports this theory. As for escape, the men have no apparent reason to abandon their posts and lives, and this comes after extensive testimony from friends and family. Another practical explanation suggests that one keeper went out to check on or secure supplies, and the others followed in an attempt to warn him against it. Then, after falling into the sea somehow, the keepers attempted to rescue their drowning comrade and were taken by the seas in turn. This theory accounts for the missing oilskins, yet it doesn't explain why all 3 went out in bad weather. Perhaps one keeper noticed something amiss with the external equipment, prompting him to exit the lighthouse, and given the camaraderie among lighthouse keepers, it's conceivable the others would follow to assist, only to be overwhelmed by unexpected weather. Britain's Northern Lighthouse Board conducted an official inquiry, concluding that in all likelihood, the keepers had likely swept away out to sea during a storm and drowned. However, the lack of concrete evidence fueled a great deal of morbid speculation among the general public. Superintendent Robert Muirhead, who claimed to have known the keepers personally, visited the lighthouse in the aftermath of their disappearance. He was among the first to conclude that it was nothing but a tragic and unforeseen accident, and while many agreed, others have accused him of organizing a cover-up. And following the incident, safety measures at lighthouses were reassessed, And this led to the introduction of better equipment, more reliable communication systems, and protocols for emergency situations that ensure that no such disappearance can reoccur in the future. The mystery has not only inspired countless stories, poems, and films, but also led to the improvements in lighthouse safety protocols, including better weather monitoring and emergency signaling systems. Theories abound, but without definitive proof, the fate of James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur continues to be a subject of intrigue and debate. Even now, more than 100 years later, the incident serves as a poignant reminder of the solitude and peril faced by those who keep watch over the sea, ensuring the safety of others at the cost of their own. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations.